Today is Tuesday the 31st of January 2012 and I am sitting here in London with Kate Love, who is Senior Lecturer at Central St Martin's College of Art and Design in London. Hello Kate.
Hello Joshua.
And we're here to talk about artists and leadership and education. And maybe I could start off by asking you a little bit about yourself. So, did you have a training as an artist?
I did. I started out, I was born in Derby and I went to Derby Foundation and I then came to Goldsmiths in 1975, Goldsmiths College, when it was not the Goldsmiths that we know today, really. Very different animal in the 1970s. And I did my BA in Fine Art there, in painting, in an old warehouse in Surrey Docks, and then I had a couple of years out of college working, and then I went back to Goldsmiths and did my MA part-time at Goldsmiths. And by that time, that was 1983, it was a very different college. I guess postmodernism had, what we've come to probably think of as a sort of postmodern, post-structuralist tendencies had worked their way through. And both the teaching and the work that was being produced was very different at that time, and I think much more engaging and much more interesting. So then I was lucky enough actually to get some teaching at Goldsmiths as I graduated from my MA, which I did for quite a few years, and then actually found that teaching became a part of a practice. I mean, obviously I still had a practice, but which I thought of as painting, but I also felt that teaching and working in art schools was a practice in and of its own, as right or self or whatever. So I sort of made it my business really to work in lots of different institutions. That was kind of guerrilla teaching. That was very much part of what I was doing, and I at present, as you just said, I'm at Central St Martin's and I work on the BA Fine Art and the MA Fine Art course there, and I also completed a PhD whilst I was at Central St Martin's, so I was both a student and a tutor at Central for a while, and in a sense that was when my practice changed slightly, because throughout the PhD I discovered that I wanted ostensibly to write about a particular philosophical concept. In my case it was experience, but I realised quite quickly that writing about experience, one had to think about the experience of writing about experience, and that quickly transformed itself into thinking about writing per se as a practice. So now in a sense what I'm actually doing very much on the BA undergraduate stage 3 and on the MA is my role, I guess, is to think about writing as a practice when students are actually doing their written submissions. So I'm trying to think of writing as not dissimilar to painting or video or whatever, that writing is a practice in its own right. So that's a sort of potted history of teaching has been a very big part of my, well, I don't like the word teaching because I don't think I'm teaching anything, but actually working with people and trying to think through their ideas with them is a massive part of my life. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting when you were talking about when you had this painting practice when you were studying your MA in the 80s, and you said that you thought of at the time your teaching practice. You did use that word, even though I understand what you're saying about the efficacy of that term. You said that you saw that as being part of your practice.
Teaching, yes, absolutely.
And do you still feel that?
Probably, weirdly, that's a very good question. Probably less so in a sense. Partly, I guess, because if I'm honest, teaching has become a lot more instrumentalised, in colleges these days. A lot of the courses I work on are unitised, for example. So it's quite hard to see a unit as quite hard to see what you're doing. I mean, obviously, you can't within those strictures, you carve out methods and ways of working, which could still possibly be construed as a practice, but I'm less interested in thinking of teaching as a practice, I suppose, personally. I think on the other hand though, when I look at, thank goodness we've got lots of young members of staff who've just started. They've taken on lots of people, and I think I noticed that when people start teaching, they do talk a lot more about it as part of their practice. Maybe something happens as you become slightly more concerned, if I'm really honest, with a product as you get older, maybe, and so the process and the process becomes not as interesting as the actual product. I'm thinking all the time about what I'm actually producing and what's going out in the world under my auspices, as it were, rather than what I'm actually doing when I'm in college. Maybe that's just a natural thing of getting older, and the relation to teaching changes. But I certainly see it in younger people, definitely.
So that's interesting. So the difference between teaching as a practice, as a form of arts practice, or not, is a focus on process.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yes, I think when I think back and when I very first started teaching, one of my first jobs was working on a foundation course for the unemployed. It was called the Lena Garnade Foundation Course for the Unemployed, and it was a absolutely fantastic course run by Kay Fido in near the Hartley's Jam Factory in Bermondsey, and the things, everybody who came on that course was on the dole and quite sceptical and nervous about what we would, what maybe a more conventional art school might be doing, turning them into a product and into a Damien Hirst was sort of quite big at that time, so they didn't want to be necessarily, they were quite sceptical, quite radical people, and they're quite, not just because they're on the dole, but they, I think they just had a bit of a life, and they didn't want to just see art as a commodity. They're a bit more sceptical about all of that. So the seminars and the actual events, or whatever we would call them, seminars and workshops and so on, were a truly kind of organic process with the staff and the students, and it was very much, there wasn't necessarily, it was a foundation course, so we were geared towards getting people into a BA, but on the whole the teaching wasn't about just furnishing their portfolios, for example. It was about learning how, taking apart every part of the teaching as we were going on, and Kay Fido was very influential in that, because she was so committed to sort of being curious about every aspect of what a pedagogical practice might be. So so the process, the teaching became a kind of organic. I don't like the word organic; it's too sort of locally sourced and all that sort of rubbish now. But in those days, all I really mean was we were all in it together. Another cliche, working on what it was that we thought we were doing every day when we turned up at this particular crappy little building that was cold and drafty and so on. So it was a process. We were certainly not working to a curriculum, or we didn't, every day was a new day that we would work out what we were actually up to, and what constituted teaching, even, what at that moment, what that's why I'm always have been very sceptical of even calling it teaching. What were we actually doing every time we went into that building? And that was the same at Goldsmiths, but it's slightly more formal in those days. But certainly when I first worked at Central St Martin's, there was a critical fine art practice course, Monica Ross and Anne Talentire, and certainly that, again, it was but business as usual in terms of process and in terms of a practice that, and I think to some extent what happens now in the degree course at Central St Martin's on the BA Fine Art, there are pathways, and there is a 4D pathway which is sort of loosely modelled on some of the ideas that were involved in the critical fine art practice course, and I think that that's still very much an ongoing process that goes on within 4D, that people are forever taking apart and rebuilding what it might be that you're doing in that space every day as an art student. So you're curious about what your role is, your function is as an art student and as a teacher, and that's forever being turned over and questioned, as it is in all the other pathways. But so certainly that was the way I approached teaching, certainly and as I say, in critical fine art practice, and to some extent Goldsmiths everywhere. Yeah. Don't know whether I've answered that properly.
Yeah, no, definitely. And there was a sense, when you were talking about those early days when you were teaching and you had what you understood as a painting practice at the same time, that you, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the implication of that, as I understood it, was that you understood what you were, who you were in the world, was that you were an artist. Is that right?
Oh, not. I mean, in the gosh, a big question there, because in the 70s, I suppose it was a very heroic, as you can imagine, heroic masculine position on that. So of course, a lot of tutors, fully inhabited that position of an artist. But I think, I, for example, was taught by Mary Kelly with we were one of the first year groups, 78, I think, 78, when Mary Kelly came to Goldsmiths, where, again, and Rita Donner, her incredibly, and Elma Thrubrand, incredibly influential women that was very, there was a sort of a paradigm shift in terms of what people thought about the term artist, and it was riddled with, we were all rather nervous of inhabiting that because of the models that had gone before, the heroic masculine model of the artist. So long answer, don't think I really ever thought of myself as inhabiting the term artist, no, because of those role models. I mean, the word on the street, of course, was cultural producer. That was what we called ourselves. I was so pathetic, so horrible now.
But even Mary Kelly at that time,
yes, yeah, definitely,
was a cultural producer.
Yeah, I mean, if you imagine at that time, 1908. I'm a little bit later now, but certainly say Barbara Kruger and Signs. Jenny Holzer, and or if you think of the Guerrilla Girls, if you think of all those women that suddenly came on stream, and obviously men as well, but we thought we had there was a project. There was a left position, in art practice. I mean, that's what we haven't talked about, but that's terribly important, because obviously if you're allied to the left, you're very sceptical to some extent this whole project that we're talking about. You're very sceptical of dogmatic leadership or heroic masculinity allied to the notion of leadership. So you're much more, inclined to think of it as some sort of movement that you're all plugged into and all trying to do your part. You're playing your part in it. So cultural producer was a much more satisfactory term. Yes, didn't think of us as artists. No.
And what about now? I mean, how do you understand what it is that you're doing? I mean, I understand that the term teaching itself is contested. I understand why that might be, and it's maybe part of what you've just articulated around wanting or needing to contest some of what the kind of historical associations of those terms might be. But do you have while that is the case, do you have a sense of an identity that is formulated through a kind of professional, for want of a better word, inhabiting of the world? So, do you think students coming up now would find it easier to say that they were artists, to use the appellation artist? Do you mean? Is that what you mean? I was thinking more about you. Me? I mean, I was thinking, do you say that you are a lecturer, or do you say that? I mean, what do you say when you? Not so much about what do you say, but what do you think? What do you think you are?
I always say, I mean, this is dead easy in a way. When I'm asked that, like conferences or papers or anything, I say I work at Central St Martin's, and so the operative word is work. I work. I mean, I am. I mean, I never let anyone ever forget that we're there because we're earning money. I mean, we're not there necessarily for our health, are we? I mean, I think that gets lost in a lot of. There's a sort of horrible thing that happens where people's, because it's all to do with being slightly patronising, as if you're there because you're there to impart some wisdom or whatever. You're there to earn hopefully a living wage if you're on a proper grade, and which they're downgrading grades at the moment, so that will soon be the end of that. But if you're there, you're there and you're working, and you're hopefully, I mean, as often the case, Joshua, when I leave some of the MA seminars in particular, I come out of there thinking I can't think of a better way to spend 2 hours in the whole world than being with a group of people who've all contracted in to sitting round and trying to work something out together in a situation that isn't a party or a pub or it's like a formal situation, which very, very rarely unfortunately happens in the world. You know, people put the telly on when they get home, and that's the end of that, or have alcohol or whatever it is. And so there you are in this room with all these people battling and trying to do this. So again, the notion of working for money is a bit weird, because I'd probably do that for nothing, because it's so fantastic. But yes, at the end of the day, I'm paid to do that. I'm paid to turn up and do it on time and leave on time. You know.
And is that articulation "I work at"? I mean, it reminds me of this thing that I learned to say when people ask, you know, where are you from?
Oh yeah,
and just saying I travel on a British passport, or I travel on a UK passport, rather than having to kind of fix an identity which is always already kind of fluid and multiple, by saying I'm British, which kind of doesn't really answer the question that they're really trying to ask. And I mean, is there something of that in saying I work at rather than I am?
Well, probably. I mean, as if anyone knows what I try and do in my work, I'm always having problems with terms, always. So I've always had a problem, for example, with the notion of my work. I mean, we had a seminar last week about that, you know, and that when artists talk about my work, I haven't got a clue what people mean by, you know, my work, because once you finish the work, it goes out in the world in a very obvious, ordinary sense. It starts to be about the way someone will interpret it. That's obvious, but in some, that much is obvious kind of thing. But more in a more nuanced sense, when you start to make something, you start to write something or paint something, the painting and the writing produces your subjectivity as you're working. So in a sense, it's as much a product, you're a product of it as you. So the idea of it being mine, or my work, you know, that somehow flows from my inner sensorium. So I have problems with my work. I have problems with a term artist. I have teacher. You know, you name it. And I don't, touch wood, I hope it's not an affectation. I really do hope it's not that. You know, as you get older, you've got to be. I don't think it's an affectation. I think it's genuinely. It's something about hearing a term and whether or not you can fully inhabit it. This is why I'm having problems, I suppose, when the conversation we've had so far about the concept of leadership. I'm having problems sort of thinking of the notion of leadership vis-a-vis artistic practice or an artist. So we'll get onto that later. I know. So anyway, I've gone off from the question you wanted me to answer. No, that's
perfect. I mean, in a way it does answer it. It absolutely answers it. And just before we do move on and grapple some of those issues around artists and leaders, and I know you want to talk about that term specifically. When you said that you think that younger teachers or younger artists coming into that environment, the art college environment, still talk about the way that you did, talk about their teaching practice as being part of their artistic practice.
Yes.
What do you think they're saying?
Oh, now then, what do you think? Well, the one thing that occurs to me, actually, having said it to you, this is the productive thing about speech, probably hadn't occurred to me until I said it, that I think it's probably when you're new to teaching and you're new in an environment, you know, it's a huge responsibility to walk into a room and do a lecture and everyone's sitting in a fixed position looking at you. That's a huge responsibility. So if you're doing that for the first time, or if the first few, you know, you're new to that, I guess the whole thing seems so shifting and mobile. What it is, you know, you're actually engaged in that contract between that you and the student, that maybe there's something about that newness, because you're still trying to find how much you're affecting them and how much they're affecting, you know, maybe, I mean, when I, for example, first went into teaching, I remember vividly one of the first classes I wrote hello on a piece of paper. Hello, you know, I actually said hello, I read it, hello. And then I thought, what do I say now? Hello, and then, you know, so in a sense you think that when you start teaching, you think that you can have it all in your head and that you go in and you do it, you know, like hello and then I am. But of course that doesn't work, you know, someone coughs, someone gets up, someone says, I really don't agree with that. So when you're new to all that, those transactions, I guess, or that relationship, intersubjective relations that go on, maybe that does feel like a process much more, and sort of does something in your head much more, that then you start to, when you're in the, maybe if you've got a studio based practice, say for example, when you're next in the studio after you've just come up, day after you've done a lecture or something, that all that vibrancy of that of really having your brain taken apart by that intersubjective relation that's gone on in teaching really affects what you're doing in your studio. I should think that's the nearest I can come to saying how it affected me. So that's therefore I think you start to call your teaching process by default, because it's sort of having such a knock-on effect to what you think you do in the studio. I mean, for example, not long after I started teaching, I mean this is way back in 82, I started as thinking as this in my studio of a questionnaire. I sent out a questionnaire to all the people I'd graduated with, and that suddenly became my practice. But I think that was me trying to think of whether I was any good as a teacher, whether I could do anything for those people as a teacher, and how I might do it better. So I thought, right, I'll interview everybody I was at college with and see what they got from their experience, and see if I can put that into my teaching. And of course, then obviously you start to say, oh yeah, my teaching's a practice, because it is. It's the two get loosened up. That's
And one other question about this before we move on to leadership thing that just occurred to me. I mean, in the more heroic model that you described, which I think still is, I still think that's around to a degree. I mean,
depends which art school you're in, definitely, yeah.
But there's this sense then that the artist is almost like a school in the old-fashioned sense, in the kind of Renaissance sense, that you enter the school of, and that your work is somehow in homage or mimetic or kind of derived from. I can certainly think of instances that I know about where that's the case. So that in a way the artist in that sense is seen as like a maestro, as the person with the do you think that exists anymore? Or?
Well, all I would say to that really rings true with me is that people will emulate what you do, certainly. I mean, for example, I always remember that with I better not say that, but I remember reading a book. He's no longer with us anymore now. He's a fantastic teacher called Madame Sarup, who used to teach evening classes at Goldsmiths, and then he wrote a book called Introduction to Postmodernism and Post-Structuralism. And when I was reading it, I suddenly thought, hang about, that's the cadence of Terry Eagleton, because I was a very big fan of Terry Eagleton. And when I looked up, of course, he had emulated the cadence, and it was almost the same. Wasn't quite the same. So that was, I don't know why I'm bringing that up, it's a bit long-winded, but basically I read students dictate and think, oh, hang about, that's my cadence there, they've got something, and I think, oh, and then it makes me think to myself, oh God, Kate, that's awful, you've got to, be careful, because you see yourself as in that way. But so there's an emulation goes on, but I don't know whether it's not the model of a sort of master or mistress that you must but it's copying, isn't it? It's just how people learn. And then they get their own way of working through doing that. But I think it would be even in some of the worst colleges I've been in, where that masculinity, that sort of and by the way, men and women both inhabit that. It's not peculiar to biological men. That sort of heroic model of teaching, that's not. I don't think student brought up on Facebook and social media and just the world as it's currently constituted are ever going to kind of look up to somebody in that way now. They're not going to.
Okay. All right, so leadership.
Absolutely, that segues nicely.
Yes. And so this kind of wider project is about kind of exploring the kind of idea of, or the kind of notion, or the words, if you like, the vocabulary of the artist as leader or thing. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the way in which artists are leading in educational institutions, and whether or not the relationship between whether or not, I suppose, they're inhabiting this role of artist in a particular way when they're in the educational setting. And, well, so let me start off by asking you, what that term artist leader, does that mean anything to you? You've already said that a lot of terms are fraught for you. I mean,
I think that's my education, by the way. Again, that was Goldsmith's 78, John Thompson. Every single thing was scrutinised, and so I emulated that, didn't I?
Well, let's scrutinise it. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I mean, what do you feel about that term? Or what flashes up for you immediately?
Like the thing that fails to signify slightly. I'm having trouble making it fit. I'm having, as I said, I think before, I'm having trouble with the work that the word or the concept leader's doing in relation to artist leader. I don't know what work it's doing. So, for example, if I think of my current situation at Central St Martin's and all the people working there, they've all got viable practices, but I don't think of them as leaders in that. I have that a real, as much as they're fantastic artists and really successful artists, I don't think of them as leaders. So this is what I'm having the problem with.
Do you have the term course leader in the college?
Interestingly, we have a unit coordinator. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, so it's a coordinator. We do have a program director. Yeah. So, but.
I was interested whether or not that term is used. All right. So to you, it doesn't signify, or it doesn't make.
It's hard work. It's hard work for me to make it signify. I mean, I can make it work, but it's not easy.
And why is that? Because the term leader comes with a certain set of, what would one call that? Preconceptions or
it's my fault. I think I mean, hitherto before this project, Joshua, I don't mind saying, I think I've probably so much trouble to struggle for me. It's a struggle. It's a bit like being dyslexic, struggling to try and get these words to work, that if something isn't that operative in my life, I'll leave that. I won't bother about it. I won't struggle with it. And maybe I haven't struggled with the concept of leader because it's not been. But I guess if I'm really, really honest with you, if it was one of those Rorschach games, the first thing you say as leader, I get David Cameron, and I get someone, a buffoon, an absolutely a sort of straw target, someone who's trying to perform this role, and clearly is absurd, an absurdity. So this is I freely admit I'm really, really banal and babyish about this.
So it designates failure in
it
some
designates
way.
failure,
and particularly
pomposity,
yes. With a kind of this notion of political failure. In a way.
Well, yes, and also all the millions of minions that go up to into any kind of leader, party political leader. That are invisible, all those civil servants that are invisible, that do actually write the things and do the hard work and get his questions ready and his answers ready and all the rest, and then this pompous hollow man comes on that we just look whether his hairstyle fits or whether he's sweating, or Nixon's sweaty upper lip, he lost his leadership because of the sweaty upper lip, so you allegedly, so that's in my mind still. That's the problem. It's not somebody. I have problems.
Well, I mean, that definition of leader, which I think would be a kind of popular one in the street.
It would. That's what I mean. I freely admit it's my fault for not thinking about this.
But I suppose it is because that is the popular kind of conception of what a leader might be.
Yes.
And therefore, artists are kind of historically not acknowledged as leaders, as real leaders, as true leaders, if you like. I mean, these are all, if you want to start contesting terms, so all those terms, real and true, need to be contested. But nevertheless, or a form of leadership that you and I might feel more sympathetic towards, it seems to me that therefore, in order to have any kind of political efficacy, it is worth interrogating this idea or this notion of an artist leader.
Oh God, yeah, and I absolutely applaud what you're doing, because it's making me think about it. And because in a way, honestly, Josh, this is an art. Here we go. In the sense of a practice, to me, this is practice. What you're trying to do with this concept is a viable artistic practice. You're trying to widen and shift and take apart and undo and put back together again a concept which has unfortunately hitherto been terribly maligned. I think in most people, because I mean, if you like, that's the biggest effect that the last few years, with all the tumbling of all the regimes, and so the notion of leader is it's terribly makes anybody nervous. So in a way, what you're doing with it, I think, is a viable artistic practice. That's how I would. You're leading the field in this, and but it is. I mean, you're trying to widen and shape and rethink it, and hopefully it is the issue with all this work. As we've from the 80s onwards, we've tried to attest is to how to make this work on a concept stick. The big issue here, I guess, is what you're doing, how the research you're involved in, how you disseminate that in order to make this work, that is critical work on the concept of leadership, stick, and not just tumble back down to its old hollow self sort of thing. But I have great faith that you will do that. So yeah,
thank you.
You always have in the past. So great faith.
So if I was to ask you a slightly different question, well, I'm going to ask it. I think I know what the answer might be already. But in your work, I know that's contested. in the job that you do, do you exercise leadership?
I fully embrace my responsibilities towards the students. Yes, and I'm not trying to be queasy and sort of artful here, but I don't think that's, again, it just doesn't come to mind. I hope I'm not, in a way I'd be nervous of thinking I was leading anybody in anything, because I don't, again, I'm having trouble with it, because it suggests that in some way someone's following me and that I'm taking them somewhere by my own volition, rather. So I wouldn't see that, but in terms of...
Can I interrupt you there? Because I understand exactly what you're saying, but I don't know, I don't believe you. I suppose, not that I think you're being disingenuous, but I think you definitely have followers. As somebody that has studied under you, if we're going to use these hierarchical terms, and I studied my MA and you were my tutor at that time, and all those things you've talked about, kind of inhabiting somebody else's voice, and I definitely felt that you were leading me into a kind of territory of possibility that I had hitherto been unfamiliar with, and I think, and maybe still am, to a degree, an acolyte of that. And that I think that's what made you an extraordinarily powerful teacher. And I know for a fact that I'm not the only person that feels like that. And so I know, sorry, this is maybe a bit cringy,
No.
But it is absolutely instrumentally to do with you. But it's also not. It's also to do with that relationship that is, we all know, it is highly romanticised, but this notion of the kind of mentor or the teacher is very culturally imbued across the world. And this kind of notion of leader and follower, it seems to me, is absolutely, in those conventional terms, very much part of an education system. So while I totally get that you are aiming for a kind of dialogic and contested interrogation between two contingencies in the classroom, if for want of a... I also wonder whether, I'm sure, well, I know for a fact from my own experience that that you are leading followers, that is something that is happening. So if I put it to you in those crude terms, what do you think of that?
It's like a nightmare. And I'm really, really trying to meet you, and I'm really trying, touch wood, hopefully not to be, as I say, sort of affected about this or torturous about it. But I mean, I remember you being a student, and you were a fantastic student. But I do remember at the time, because it was what I was very excited about, and still am, about a lot of material that we were working with then in the seminars and so on. And all I felt my role was, or my responsibility, again, I was getting paid for this. My role and responsibilities were to be really as much as I could to be in touch with all the kind of innovative and sort of interesting ideas that were prevalent at the time, and my role was to bring those together. So in a way, I think that I've got it a bit better here, that where leadership is sort of singular, slightly leading someone, is suggesting that it's me, my own volition, my own ideas, channeling. I'm like the medium through which the message flows or whatever, that there's something like that's where I balk and becomes nightmarish, because all I felt was like I was somehow just a hunter-gatherer that was trying to bring everything together that was good at that time, or whatever good is, but interesting and really useful, and that was my role. And so
sorry, I'm interrupting again.
No?
But that description which you've just given me of what your role was is pretty much identical to some of the big cultural leaders, in inverted commas, that I've heard talk over the course of this course thing. They describe their role as bringing together the innovators. That's what they describe their role as. Yeah. I mean, I wonder whether...
Yeah, I agree.
All right.
No. You finish what you're saying.
No. Just that thing. I think that, in a way, I think we're getting... Maybe it's a semantic argument rather than a conceptual one that we're having. That
semantic's always conceptual, though.
All right. Well, so I want to unfix this term that has become fixed. The term leadership. And for it to re-mean, if you will, or to
re-signify.
Re-signify.
Yeah. I mean, but which has been the project, I guess, of critical practice. That's all its project, isn't it? To make things or enable things, or try very hard to think about re-signification. I mean, that was always been the project of a critical practice. So what you're doing is no different, and I think. I mean, maybe we shouldn't like you when we were talking earlier about David Cameron, and you said, oh well, that's, and then later on you said something about it, like the more kind of crude, and I don't know whether it is crude. I mean, if you went now and did a vox pop in the street, probably most people would say some leader, Putin, or they would talk about leadership in terms of as a figurehead, a popular. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If that's the currency that term has, I think we should work with that. And maybe there's not a bigger problem than that. That on a popular level, it has very difficult associations. And so when you bring it into an atmosphere of, what practice or a critical practice, of course it's going to start to have a sort of rough ground. That's friction, because the two aren't sitting very comfortably together. You wouldn't want to accept a term like leader or leadership, unproblematically within an art school. It's the very place where everything gets, taken apart. That's the point of an art school, isn't it, really? So.
But that, to me, is what makes it a far more interesting form, certainly of education, but I would argue of leadership itself, than the kind of model, the vox pop model, the kind of political model of the figurehead, and that.
Definitely, and that's I can see that now. It's dawning on me over these months that we've talked about this. That's your project, isn't it? You're thinking of the notion of leadership very much as the context of art, or the culture of art, and so on, is the very place where that work should be done. That's what you're doing, and I applaud that. As I say, the problem is getting it to stick, and that is always the problem with anything, But queer stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, that Judith Butler's thing about getting concepts to stick, and the pain that's involved in re-signification, it comes at a price, so there will probably be a price to be paid for this. And I think in terms of like for example, that I got an email to tell me that there was staff development programme at CSM, Central St Martin's, about on leadership, and it was sort of like anathema, the last thing in the world I would ever imagine myself spending time, or so there's probably there's a lot of work to be done, I think, to get people to embrace it in the way that you quite rightly are wanting and working towards. But then I think that will only happen through possibly this dissemination of this project and people being curious about it, so that when they see a staff development workshop on leadership, they won't immediately go, oh my God, what's this? But actually think quite critically. That would be your work done, wouldn't it, if people approached it, a staff development day on leadership, with a sort of creative, open-hearted approach that they would to, say, a day on working in the environment, or whatever they might have staff development days on.
I mean, just to, I suppose, I don't want you to think that, or anyone listening to this, that I'm curious, I suppose. I'm not at the level where I want everybody to understand leadership in the terms of, I don't know that actually.
You're not proselytising.
No, I don't know that I want leadership to re-signify. Even though I said that, I suppose I do. That's what I think, because that, if you like, the cultural behaviour of the art, or the way what artists do, and I think really what art education does is to produce a kind of way of being and a way of thinking that is healthy. I mean,
I remember you saying this, that constitutes leadership, so why can't we kind of embrace it as such? That's what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like, it's not really that I want the world to understand artists as the best leaders or anything like that. It's that I want artists themselves to kind of think of potentially that they might be leaders. So to end up at the place that you just talked about, so that they might go along to a staff development day about leadership, because they might see, all these things that you talked about responsibility and role and innovation, that they might see that what they are doing is a form of leadership somehow.
And embrace it.
And embrace
creatively,
that.
like you said earlier. Yeah, and critically and usefully, because it's got to be. There's no point trying to make something re-signify unless it's useful to the world. Is it that queer was the concept of queer, and making that re-signify has been very useful. So unless it's useful in some way for an artist to understand what they're doing as in terms of leadership, or to be a leader, then. Yeah, may I ask you a question? What would you see it as being useful for some? Like your thesis, in a sense, is that what's happening already, what artists are doing already, is constitutes leadership, or they're leading, if you like. And so, what is useful for them to recognise that, fully embrace that? What would you see as the point of wanting someone to fully embrace that?
Well, I suppose when I started being this first artist fellow on the Clore Leadership Programme, a lot of my artist colleagues, like quite a lot of well-respected artists, were like, "What is that?" It was laughable, to them, and like, how is it being a leader? What are you? As if it was kind of a role that I would somehow assume.
Gary Glitter, is it? No, Gary Glitter's the leader. No.
Oh yeah, yes. Gary Glitter's famous for other things. Okay, and even people on the leadership course themselves, none of them are artists, were kind of a bit confused what an artist was doing on that. And I suppose it's that confusion that an artist, that artist and leader are somehow an antithesis, that they don't match. That I want to question, and to allow for the possibility that an artist might consider themselves to be a leader, in order, and this maybe comes to answer your question, that they might grow and take more responsibility and see themselves in a position of affecting change, as I think they already often are, in a kind of more instrumental, maybe that's a very dodgy term, but way. so it's about fulfilling potential, I suppose. And I think it's also a political thing. I think that we need more people in society taking active roles, leadership roles, that have the kind of training and sensibility that artists have.
So the usefulness of it, of an artist embracing them, is really for the way the world would respond to their work. I mean, I'm thinking of Thomas Hirschhorn, say, for example, and all the projects that he's done in so-called sort of socially engaged, or whatever you might want to, working with certain groups of people in particular settings. I'm hesitating to use the word community, but in certain communities. I mean, you would say that for, mind you, I think he does possibly embrace that as a leading a certain group of people. I think he probably wouldn't have a problem with that, and so that would be your work would be done if that were the case, and that people would come to his work and see him as leading the way as an artist in that particular community, doing a particular project. So the fact that he'd embraced that, and that the world had embraced that, your work would be done.
Well, I don't know if my work would be done. I don't think it's about my work. I mean, I'm definitely feeling that term to be contested now. But what it would do, what would happen is you would, I suppose it would potentially give the possibility for more of that work to happen.
Yeah. To what, agencies funding it, that they would...
Well, across the board, but for artists themselves to think of what they might do in those terms, and for curators to work with those artists. And it's very, very interesting talking... I mean, this is maybe separate from this interview, and we're going to have to watch the time, but it's very interesting talking to curators about this notion of artist as leader, because some curators see themselves as leading, as the practitioner, and other curators see themselves in service to the artist, that the artist is leading them. And that is a very different form of curatorial approach, and I think it has a very different reverberation in terms of how an artist might work, or how the art might circulate, depending on how a curator responds or works with an artist. Anyway, we're moving away from the... Well,
I don't know, because when I was listening, I don't know whether I heard you right, but if you said certain curators think they're leading and certain things think they're at the service of, you see, that's probably where I'm having the issue here, is that I don't think it's either, is it? If you think of curation, it's absolutely, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, talking about everybody being in a room trying to work out what on earth they were doing in an art school, calling themselves art students and art teachers, right from the, on a day-to-day basis. I mean, when you're in the process of curating, it's completely and utterly relational. You're going from one person having a bit more power to another, and it's forever moving and mobile, and someone has an idea born out of a particular relationship, etc., etc. So that's why I'm probably that's where the whole, maybe it's something to do with the grammar, the tense of the leader or leadership, because it's just it's singular, it feels singular, that, whereas most creative processes are ongoing and multiple. I mean, I'm not being hopefully not, that they vary and they're variable, so that to say I'm either in the service of or I'm leading people, neither are adequate.
Neither are adequate, but again, it's. I mean, I totally agree with you that is the kind of actuality of it, if you like.
Yeah.
But there is also a thing about how people position themselves and how they identify themselves, which becomes the kind of reality to a degree.
Maybe I mean, like you said, got to watch the time, but maybe we're nearing the nub of this, really, because that's it, isn't it? It's how you position yourself, and what you're trying to do is, I guess, if I understand you, is to think critically about how artists position themselves as or not, or as, you know, within the context of the concept of leadership, where they position themselves. And maybe that's it, Josh. I mean, maybe it's just my age, you know, 55, come up through such a lot of post-structuralist theory that it's hard to ever think of yourself as having the power or the mastery or the agency to position to of your own volition to position yourself as anything, you know, leader or innovative or whatever term you know. So the idea of looking at this concept and thinking about it, re-signifying, reworking it, reconceptualizing it, so that artists might think more critically about positioning themselves. But that's my problem, I guess, that whether you want the agency to think of yourself, to think your way into a position in that way, or whether that's necessarily something that will be done to you. You know, again, it's relational, but you'll be seen retrospectively as having. I'm thinking of, you know, really good shows, that curated shows, that you think that it's because they've really worked well, and then you look for who did this. You want to, and that's the saddest thing. You never. Unfortunately, it all becomes invisible, all the relationships that have gone on to make that happen, and it becomes, you know, collapsed down to one figurehead of one curator. And if you've ever been involved in anything like that, you know jolly well it's not like that. But of course, you kind of look for who's responsible when either things go right or go wrong, don't you? So it's something done retrospectively, I think. So whether or not an artist is seen to be innovative and as a leader is something that's not within their own remit, is it? Their own agency. It's
to a degree. I mean, I agree with what you said, except that nobody, I think, in any field really would, or very few people would say, I am a leader. I mean, almost no one would. No. So I'm not thinking about it in those kinds of terms. I don't think what you said is any different whether you work in, you know, catering or you work in arts practice. I think what this is more about is thinking of leadership less as a role which people inhabit as a figurehead, and more about exercising leadership, practicing leadership, and thinking of what you're doing as something which you are taking responsibility for. In a way, it is what you've articulated that you do that I consider to be leadership. But maybe it is the case that the term is not useful because it is just, the meaning is crystallised, and that...
No meaning is ever crystallised forever. No. I mean, like when Obama, I was thinking of him when he was elected. I mean, in a way, probably leader was glam then. You know, maybe the word leader was cherished more. You know, because somebody had taken on that role that who people could identify with and thought probably did have a lot of hope for, and so on. So no, I don't think it's ever crystallised. But yeah, I don't know. Oh God, I wish I could go back to where you were then, because that maybe again that was nearer to what we're saying, that it's not, no one necessarily of their own accord calls themselves that, but that you identify with it as a process while you're in it, which is sort of, again, really going back to the beginning, isn't it? A little bit about a practice, or seeing teaching as a practice, that what you're trying to think is having a sort of meta level. You're doing something, whatever it might be, out in the world, and calling it, you know, an artistic practice, or you're making a claim that it might be an artistic practice. Whether it is or not, it's the world to decide, but that's what you think you're doing. And at the same time, on a sort of meta level, you're sort of inhabiting this process that you might be leading something whilst you're carrying out this practice. Maybe there's, and again, I suppose all I want to know is, so what is the usefulness of having that meta level of, I'm doing this practice, but I'm also leading. I'm leading this project, or I'm a leader here. No, that's not what you're saying. You're not saying I am a leader. It's that you're thinking in terms of, when you're making some work, you're thinking that you're kind of being innovative or leading the field. The work, we haven't talked about that. We like leading the field. That's the way I probably get nearest to sort of understanding what leadership might mean if you're leading the field. Because yes, if you're looking at stem cell research, or macular degeneration research, or someone, like last week they made a massive breakthrough with macular research, so that someone is leading that research. So that, you know, in the sense that it's innovative and no one's got there yet with it. I guess maybe that's the problem, on the issue, not the problem with art practice, that it's the way that art relates to the world. It doesn't relate to the world in the way that scientific research relates. You know, it's not uncovering something that's necessarily never been uncovered before, is it? It's rearranging things to greater satisfaction, maybe, I don't know, art. So it's just, maybe it's a, you know, kind of paradigm, no, what do they call it in philosophy, a category mistake. You know, that we're trying to use a concept in one category and it won't sort of flop into another one. It doesn't have the same currency in another one, because what's actually the relation of language subjectivity and world in art and language subjectivity and world in scientific research are not the same language games, are they? They're not the same. So maybe leadership isn't. That's why we're having, or rather I'm having trouble kind of getting the two to work, where I'm quite happy to say someone's leading scientific research.
That is strange to me, in a way, that
yeah.
you'd be so happy with one and not with the other.
Yeah, it's weird to me as well.
Well, maybe on that note we have to leave it there. Okay, love, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua.